So welcome to the Market Mentors podcast, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So I can't imagine there's a single marketer out there who doesn't want to be better at influencing buyer behavior. So I'm excited to get stuck into this one. But before we do, I'd love to find out what your relationship is with influencing buyer behavior.
So that's a great question. And I think I came to my role as a marketer a little bit later in life. Most of my background up until I started working for Corporate Visions, or right before I started working for Corporate Visions, was in sales. So I had kind of a different relationship with buyers than I think a lot of marketers. And I was the salesperson who always rewrote all of the marketing content. And eventually somebody just said to me, Leslie, if you think you're so good at this, why don't you just come be a marketer? And I said, oh, that's a really great idea. So I've been a marketer ever since. But one of the things that I think marketing has gotten away from, and marketers are way better at everything that they do now than I've ever seen in the past. But one of the things that I feel like marketers have kind of gotten away from a little bit is the core of what it means to be a marketer, because we all get caught up in the data and the strategies and the tactics. And, at the end of the day, what being a great marketer really comes down to is, are you able to create a great message? Are you able to create content to communicate that message? Are you able to represent it in a way that is visually stunning and compelling? And ultimately, what is the story that you want to tell? And mastering kind of those four skills are kind of what I think about as the core of being a marketer, and they're the time immemorial skills as well. They're the stuff that we take for granted almost as marketers, but we shouldn't, because they are what it means, and all the data and everything else all around it support those four core skills.
Yeah, I agree with that because, you're thinking these days there's so much noise about playbooks, tech tools, growth hacks, all this kind of stuff. Actually bringing it back to the fundamentals is really important. I think you're right.
Yeah.
A lot of people do get lost there. So, we're talking obviously about how you can influence buyers at the moment. I mean, how has buying behavior changed them?
So, and I think this is not going to come as a big shock to any marketer, right? I think we all know that buying behavior has moved online. It's become digital. And there's a stat that I've been sharing for the past couple of years that 80% of the buying journey now takes place in a digital setting. I heard a couple of weeks ago that number is now up to 93%. So I had to change all my decks. But so much of what marketers do and what buyers do is try to avoid sales contact as long as possible and do as much of their own research as possible. But it's actually harder for buyers now too, because you have so many different people who are now involved in the buying process. The number of stakeholders has gone from 8 to 11 to 15 to as many as 20 people who all want to weigh in on this major B2B buying purchase. And with less sales contact and less ability for all of those stakeholders to be able to make sense of the information that they're receiving, the burden really falls on marketers to be the storytellers, to be the translators, to be the ones who make sense of all of that information for the buyers.
Yeah, well, you hear horror stories of, people, and buyers are obviously wise to this, as you well know yourself, and obviously the data points to it. But, buyers downloading a piece of content and then they're suddenly getting phoned up by, an SDR team or something like that. So,
Yep.
they're just not at the point of actually making a decision at all or wanting a call.
Yep.
But at a very sort of top level, and without sort of getting into the sort of detail, we'll get into that further down the line.
Sure.
But what's the sort of biggest factor that buyers say influence their decision then?
So I'd say the number one, and buyers don't say this, but this is what we know. The number one factor influence a buying decision is memory. And it's really fundamental, but people make decisions based on what they remember, not on what they forget. And that makes sense logically, right? But so memorability becomes the core thing that you have to infuse into everything that you do as a marketer, because if they don't remember, they can't buy from you. And it really kind of becomes that simple. So first and foremost, memorability is the key.
Yeah, fair enough. So how do you think marketers can be more memorable then?
So there's, as I said, it boils down to those four key skills, but it's not
Mm.
just being able to create a great message. It's about being able to create a great message that people are going to remember. And you do that by using techniques and using messaging strategies that are going to embed that memory into your buyer's brain, into your buyer's psyche. The same with the content, the same with the visuals, and the same with the stories that you tell. There is actually science behind all of this. There's science behind how people process information, how people perceive information. All of that feeds into memory and feeds into what it is that they remember about your message, about your story, about the content that you create.
And is that simply when you talk about science, putting almost people in experiments then,
Yeah,
giving them messages, giving them things to look at, and then actually just testing to see what actually happens off the back of it?
yeah. We actually, and at Corporate Visions, we actually have an entire arm of our business that is devoted to. We call it B2B Decision Labs, but it's devoted to the testing part of the equation. So we do behavioral studies where we do simulations of actual messages, where we'll get people together and we'll have them view a message or hear a message, and then we'll ask them a series of questions about their reaction to that. We use EEG studies, so we'll put actually the cap with the electrodes on people's heads and use eye tracking to see how they respond to a presentation or a story. And then we
Wow.
field test all of that too, because ultimately you want to make sure whatever you do is going to work in the real world. So we field test that as well. And then we all kind of bundle all of those things together in different studies that we release. But we
Wow,
just find
fantastic.
that, kind of paying attention to the science behind why buyers make the decisions they do, what they remember, what they act on is key to creating those great messages, those great stories. And
It makes total sense.
and it actually makes things easier too, because I think a lot of times marketers get caught up on who's the persona and what does the who is the persona you're speaking to, and this is your persona is Joe and he's a director of IT and he lives in a split level ranch with his wife Susie and his two kids Johnny and Jane and the dog named Patches. And they kind of focus on that versus pulling back and realizing that human beings are human beings. Their brains make decisions the same way, regardless of who they are and what their job is. The decision making and the kind of the core psychology behind those decisions does not change, based on your role or based on your jobs. So understanding that psychology and speaking to that psychology has got to be the foundation for anything that you do as a marketer.
Well, I like Caldini's book. I think, is it Caldini's
Yep.
book? Is it the
Yep.
the I'm trying to think what the title is now. Is it Persuasion or Influencing or something like that? But
It's something about persuasion. Yeah.
it a fascinating read, and it goes
Yeah.
back to the sort of psychology, which in essence is kind of going to the heart of what you started talking about at the start, really. So,
Yep.
so if we're talking about sort of four factors, then the sort of messaging, the content, the visuals, the story. If we sort of break
Yep.
this down a bit more, then
Sure.
how do you think a company can improve its messaging then?
So, and that's a great question because there's a kind of a fundamental mistake that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations make when they create messages. We did a survey a few years ago at Corporate Visions because what we wanted to find out was how people message differently to prospects and existing customers. Is there a difference? Because we've done messaging workshops with our customers for years. And one of the things that our customers used to ask us all the time when we did messaging was, "Hey, this is really great. You created this new prospect message for us. It's awesome, but we kind of own the market, and 80% of our business comes from existing customers. Should we create different messages from them?" And for years, we would say, we think so. It was a good enough message to get them in the door, and it should be good enough to, keep them there.
Yeah.
And that was what we delivered. That was the story that we told to our customers. And then we decided that we should actually test it. So we did. So we went out and we tested this messaging. And the results that came back said, no, you actually need to message to customers differently than you message to prospects. And we didn't believe it. So we ran the study again and results came back the same. We ran it a third time. And finally, the scientists that we ran the study with came back to us and said, there's a thing called status quo bias, and it's called status quo bias for a reason. human beings hate change. They don't like to change. All things being equal, the brain would like to just keep doing the same thing because the brain is a fundamentally lazy organ. And you have to create a message for a new prospect. Your goal has got to be to disrupt status quo bias. You've got to get the brain to realize that it needs to do something different and it needs to do something different now. But when you get to the other side of the equation, when you're talking to an existing customer, the last thing in the world you want to do is disrupt their status quo because you are the status quo. You are the incumbent. So you have to change your message. And instead of disrupting the status quo, you need to defend the status quo because now you are the status quo. And that is you. So you've got to defend your incumbent position. And once we realize that you can't create messages the same way for both of those audiences. So the goal of a prospect message is to disrupt, to get them to change, to get them to choose you, and to get them to do it now. But when you're talking to an existing customer, you're either going to want to just reinforce the status quo so that they stay with you, so that they keep buying the same thing over and over again, or chances are you want to sell them new stuff. So then you have to introduce a message of control change. And that's a tricky one, right? Because you need them to change, but not away from you, but change with you. So we call that a why evolve message, because what you want them to do is you want them to take that step and buy that bigger or different solution, but do it with you. So you got to give them just enough disruption to make them nervous, but then lean on the relationship that you have with that customer, that trust that they have in you to say, hey, we've gotten you this far. Trust us to go in this direction with you as well. So very different message frameworks, very different techniques for creating those messages, very different ways to leverage your buyer psychology to get them to either change or change with you.
And I think it's super important because we live in such a world where there's so much choice, isn't there? Especially within our market, which is sort of B2B tech. There are so many new solutions out there. So there are plenty of companies looking to disrupt. Yeah. And if you're an incumbent, then there are plenty of people that are wanting to disrupt you. So actually how you communicate to those customers that you've already got is really key. And actually, a lot of our businesses are SaaS businesses whereby the cost to change from one solution, just if you're looking at the cost alone, is it's relatively low. It's not a difficult thing to do. So, really important for those sort of businesses as well.
And so I'm glad that you brought that up about SaaS companies particularly, because I think a lot of organizations are catching on to the fact that you really need to have a solid investment in customer success to make sure that you're leveraging what we call the incumbent advantage, right? The challenges with customer success, a lot of customer success managers are wonderful at keeping the customer happy and identifying with the customer and, resolving issues and, driving adoption and all the things that customer success has traditionally done. But what a lot of customer success organizations aren't as good at is messaging value because they don't feel like it's their job. They feel like it's a sales thing. But what we're seeing more and more is that the companies that get customer success right are the ones that train their customer success managers to message value, to reinforce the relationship, to be the ones to sometimes raise those issues with a customer that might be uncomfortable, that might create a little bit of tension. But if they're not hearing, your customers aren't hearing those things from you, they're hearing them from the competition. And you don't want to be caught in the position of a trusted customer coming back to you and saying, hey, my boss just pulled me into his office and reamed me out for 10 minutes about XYZ issues. Why didn't you guys tell me this was going on? So more and more, we're seeing that getting customer success in line with this retention messaging, this upsell messaging is critical to keeping those customers. Because if you're not messaging to them the right way, your competition is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think customer success teams are sort of fairly early on in their development, as sort of SaaS has become sort of more important as well. So it's interesting to hear that. So the second part, we've obviously built our messaging then. We've got our messaging right for whichever sort of angle we're taking then. How would you suggest a company uses content then to influence a buyer?
So this is the sad thing, and this is a very sad thing. I've been a writer my whole life, and that's kind of my number one passion. Is I love writing, I love creating content, I love developing messages. But the really sad thing that most content creators learn eventually is, and this is a scientific fact, is that your audience is going to forget 90% of what you share with them within 48 hours after you share it. Whether it's
Oh
a,
dear.
whether it's an ebook, whether it's a presentation, whatever it is, their brain is going to forget 90% of that. Now, so you talk about this fact that what that leaves is that 10% message. Like, what is the 10% that they will remember? You can't make them remember any more than 10%. But what you can do is you can control what the 10% is that they remember. And that's what marketers need to understand. And that kind of gets down to stripping down to its very core. What is the essence of that message? What is that 10% essence that you want them to remember? And then repeating it again and again and again and again, and organizing the rest of that piece of content around that 10% message. So if you think about something like an ebook, for example, the way that we do our ebooks at Corporate Visions is we identify what is the 10% message of this story, this ebook that we're creating. And then we use that as the organizing principle for that ebook, for that piece of content. And you can have, supporting details or supporting pillars that come off of that 10% message. We organize our content around the message and then those supporting pillars. The same with a presentation. If you're creating a PowerPoint, for example, you're going to identify what is that 10% slide, and you come back to it again and again and again, and you use that as the organizing principle for that presentation. And everything always comes back to that. So at the end of the day, your audience walks away and they're like, oh, okay, well, I remember XYZ, and it should be that 10% message.
And can that help you translate into, can you go back from that and say, well, actually, I'm going to create an ebook. This is our 10% message, but actually, this is how long it needs to be then? Is there a sort of correlation between something being too long or too
Yeah.
short?
So what we usually say is that if you usually we think three is a magic number. Just for whatever reason, the brain remembers things in threes. So what we always try to do is we come up with three or at the most four kind of pillars that support that 10% message. And then we organize the content into those pillars that then roll up to the 10% message. So that structure, by definition, by design, limits how long that piece of content can be. Obviously, you don't want it to run on forever, but kind of organize it around those pillars, and the excess content will kind of self-select its way out of that piece of content.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about the repeating the message. When you talk about that, I'm then thinking about political parties. Not that this is a political podcast, but actually you probably see it in action there more often than perhaps you would do in other areas, because they are simply trying to get that message out there.
Yep.
And at times they do seem like they're just saying that catchphrase, saying that catchphrase,
Yep.
saying that catchphrase. So,
Yep.
and it does
And
stick. It does work, doesn't it?
simple, resonant, and memorable. Yeah,
Mm, mm.
without a
So
doubt.
the third bit then is sort of what a lot of people would think about what marketing is going years back, isn't it? Sort of the
Yeah.
visual side of it, and what some sort of old school companies and sort of think of marketing now, which is kind of making things look nice. But visuals plays an important part too. Then.
Yeah. Yeah, it does without a doubt. And this is again kind of a sad trap that marketers fall into, because you have this I think every marketer kind of operates in the back of our minds like, oh, I don't want to bother people. I don't want to make things too difficult for people to understand. I need to simplify, 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 simplify. And the brain actually needs a little bit of complexity to remember, to encode a memory. So if you oversimplify your visuals, if you just have kind of a pie chart and that's all you've got, then the brain actually tends to gloss over that. So adding a little complexity to your visuals and a little bit of contrast is really key, like giving the brain something to compare on a slide, the before and the after, something like that, actually helps the brain remember better. Simply using, like kind of the smart art that comes with Microsoft, can actually oversimplify your content to the extent to your visuals to the extent that they become unmemorable because they look just like everybody else's. And another thing that marketers tend to shy away from is being a little bit too out there. I mean, I can't even count the number of brand organizations at my clients that I've had to go up against to try to like get some of these principles through. But dropping, like if you're creating a PowerPoint presentation, for example, dropping a completely unexpected slide at key points within the presentation, like right before your 10% message, really perks the brain up and gets the brain to realize, whoa, I thought I was just watching an ordinary average PowerPoint presentation, but there's something else that's weird that's going on here. I better pay attention. That primes the brain for what's coming next, which should be your 10% message. So using unexpected visuals, representing concepts or words in different ways than just your traditional charts, and steering clear of stock images that are cliches. Like I think every marketer has in their deck that image of the worried businessman, the guy with the gray hair who's bent over his desk with his head in his hands, worrying about all the problems ahead of him. Like everybody's got that. And whenever I use that example in a presentation, marketers always laugh because they're like, it's in my bag, right? But it's just using unexpected visuals, using non-cliche visuals, using visuals in places where you wouldn't expect to see them, and then following some universal design principles, which means consistent shapes, consistent colors, consistent line weights, the way that you arrange things on a slide, for example, or what you reveal and the order in which you reveal it draws focus and attention to what you want your buyers to look at first, and then you augment it and you add that on. So a real quick trick that marketers can use is, kind of the slow unveiling of a visual or an idea or of a concept so that the brain has time to look at it, encode it, remember it, absorb it before you add the next piece versus just giving them everything and expecting them to be able to sort through all that.
No, that's interesting. And actually, the
Yeah.
first bit that you talked about there, I've sort of come across that sort of called pattern interrupt. And
Yep.
actually, I've come across that more on sort of YouTube, where you're trying to keep people, watching your video for a short period of time, and you are actually trying to change things around a little bit,
Yep.
which is exactly that. You kind of jolting them into keeping watching it. And actually, I'm going to sound a little bit old now, but with my kids, I like watching, some of the old films, and you're like, this is an amazing film, and you watch it, and it's just like really slow compared to the fast sort of films that they put on now, where
Yeah.
literally they're trying to keep the attention of the audience for that whole 2 hours. So
Yeah.
that really makes a lot of sense.
We have a concept that we talk about in our training we call it the hammock. And it's a really simple principle, but it's people remember 100% of what you tell them or 70% of what you tell them at the beginning of a message, about 20% of what you tell them in the middle, and then 100% of what you say at the end. And if you think about your typical corporate PowerPoint presentation, we always tell people we can predict the first 5 slides of every standard company presentation, right? Like you have the title slide, then you have your agenda slide, then you have the about us slide, and then you have the history of your company slide, and then you have the logo slide. With you can just feel it coming at you like a slow moving freight train. And by that time, by the time you get through those 5 slides, that's when you got 70% of your buyers' attention. They've seen it all before, they tune out. And so when you finally get into the meat of the presentation, the stuff that they should care about, and they're down in that 20% hammock portion of it. So you have to find ways to spike their attention all the way through that presentation. You do that by opening hot with something that is unexpected and closing with something hot and unexpected, and then jarring them throughout that presentation.
Awesome. So the last bit then is storytelling, which is really big at the moment, isn't it?
Yep.
How would you suggest sort of, a company using all the elements that we've talked about now then, and then building that into sort of storytelling?
So there is science behind storytelling as well, and the idea of storytelling in business has caught on, and everybody talks about it. But I think people understand business storytelling a little bit differently. Like when they think about business storytelling, they often think about it as a story about you, as a story about your solutions and your products. And maybe you have a case study in there and there's a story about the case study. And that's what people tend to think of as storytelling. But at the end of the day, the business stories that you tell should be about your buyer. Your buyer is the hero of the story. And you have to tell a story about their journey. And like I said, there is science behind storytelling. There's an awesome book, by the way, which I recommend to anybody who's listening to this podcast, called Wired for Story, and it's by a woman named Lisa Cron, Cron, and it's a book for fiction writers. But I recommend it to every business writer as well because the concepts of fiction writing and business writing are very, very much the same. But it's all about how the brain reacts to stories. But there's actually three scientific components to what makes a great story, and they are perceptive, cognitive, and affective. And the perceptive components are simply the things that you experience with your senses. So the things that you see, the things that you hear, the things that you taste and smell, and how do you describe those in the story? And then the other part of perceptive is action across time. Like something needs to happen in the story. The hero needs to undergo some sort of change and get to a better outcome. So if you translate that into a business story, that means that your buyer, who is the hero of the story, needs to see themselves progress through that change. They need to face a challenge. They need to overcome that challenge. They need to see what the outcome of that is going to be. And that's all the perceptive part of the stories. Cognitive is the data, it's the hard facts. And a lot of marketers lean really, really hard into cognitive because it feels safe from a business perspective. Like, oh, if I just throw all these statistics at someone, then they'll sort through them and they'll understand. And you need cognitive, but I think business writers over rely on cognitive a little bit too much. And then the final component of storytelling is affective, which is feelings, which is emotion. Again, something that business writers tend to shy away from because we're told that you shouldn't be emotional, you should just be fact-based. That's all buyers care about. But every buyer has emotions, and decisions are made emotionally. They're not made rationally. People make decisions with emotion and justify them with facts, which is why you need the cognitive in there. But you have to be able to appeal to their emotions. And I don't like to talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt as something that, marketers should rely on, but you do have to introduce risk. You do have to engage them emotionally. You need to make them want something. And a lot of times you make them want something by showing them the risk, either the risk of not changing if you're trying to get to a new customer, or the risk of changing if you're talking to an existing customer. So you need to be able to balance that introduction of risk in your story so that you're not going overboard with it, but you're letting them know what the stakes are. Because at the end of the day, every story is about stakes. What do they have invested in solving this problem and finding this solution?
Yeah, because I think you think about presentations going back years ago, it was all about the company, the product.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now it's very much the other way, isn't it? As you talked about, it's more that story about what is happening in the overall market, and
Yep.
therefore what are you potentially missing out on, or what are the risks there if you don't do. So that
Yeah.
emotional stuff, and emotion is key, isn't it? You hear of people
Yeah.
buying things because they have an affinity with the people, the brand, whatever it might be. So I think emotion is really, really key.
And to give marketers credit, and I give them a ton of credit in this, I think most really, really good marketers know. They know now that you can't go out and just talk about yourself and talk about your
Mm,
stuff. They get
mm.
that, and they've gotten that for years. But the mistake that I think marketers make is not that they're talking about themselves, but that they're generalizing benefits a little bit too much. We've been told for years, sell the value, sell the value, sell the value, right? So we tend to use like really high level, fluffy, adjective, superlative type language to talk about our stuff like state of the art and
Best
you'll
in
get this
class.
great benefit, you'll increase customer engagement, all benefits, which is great, but benefits aren't differentiated. Like, because your competition is not out there saying, hey, you know what's different about us? you'll use our stuff, you will never engage a single customer again, right? Like everybody's saying the same thing. What our research shows is that including the right, what we call telling details in your story, um, tangible, concrete things that your buyer is going to be able to do differently with your solution, not the benefits that they'll achieve, but the actual actions that they're going to be able to take, increase the credibility and persuasiveness of a pitch by up to 95%.
Wow. Because that, I think of going back years ago when I, was doing a little bit of selling, not for very long
Yeah.
and not very well either. But I was always taught about features and benefits. But as you talk
Mhm.
about it, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because the benefits are always things like, reducing operational complexity,
Yeah.
reducing costs. They become very samey, don't they? And in a
Yeah.
world where you're trying to differentiate, it's not a good place to be.
Yeah, and it's a really simple exercise. It's about asking the next level question down, right? So you say you'll be able, if you buy our thing, you'll be able to reduce operational costs. Well, great, duh. You're not gonna say that you're gonna increase operational costs. But the question, the level down question is how. How do you do that? What action can you specifically take with our thing to reduce operational costs? So, for example, when you buy XYZ logistics, your truck drivers will be able to type their route into a GPS location and get the fastest way to that location. That's a telling concrete detail about what your buyer is going to be able to do that will result in the lower operational costs. But you're giving them the ability to make that connection themselves. And when they do that, that encodes the memory in their brain, much more than you just telling them the high level abstract idea.
Yeah, excellent. Where can people go to find out more about this? It's been an absolute fascinating chat with you, Leslie.
Yeah, so Corporate Visions, www.corporatevisions.com. In our resource library, we have all of our research studies, as well as a number of tools and checklists and different things that you can use to put some of these concepts into action. You can also go to b2bdecisionlabs.com and get just the straight research and the research briefs and all of the studies and scientific experiments that we've done to explore these different concepts. But yeah, come on over and download whatever you want, and we're happy to have a more detailed conversation with anyone. And you can also follow me on LinkedIn. Reach out to me directly, Leslie Talbot. Really simple, and I'd be happy to answer any questions folks have.
Well, I've learned loads from this, so thank you very much. I'm sure our listeners have too. It's been great having you on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.